Sometimes, when the wind catches the corner of the house just right, it sounds exactly like the scrape of a wooden drawer opening in a room that should be empty. I sit in the dark now, the battery-powered clock on the nightstand ticking, with a sharp plastic rhythm that never belonged in the home of my childhood. I was 58 years old when the floorboards finally gave up what they had been hiding. By then, almost every hand that had built the lie, every tongue that had sworn to keep it, was already resting beneath a plain gray headstone in the orchard. I sit awake at night, the cold settling into my knuckles, wondering how many of them looked at me across the long wooden benches during Sunday church dinners. How many passed the butter or nodded at my father's prayers, while carrying a secret that made my entire life look like a house drawn in the dirt before a heavy rain. Amish families are quiet by nature. We do not throw glass or scream until the neighbors hear. We bury things. We push the shame deep into the damp earth beneath the floorboards and pretend the ground is level. My name is Esther, and my life began in the rolling, heavy hills of Holmes County, Ohio. If you had driven your buggy past our farm back then, you would have seen nothing but peace. The corn grew tall and straight. The fence lines were whitewashed every spring until they blinded you in the noon sun, and the horses in the barn were always fed before the children. My father was a deacon, a tall man whose voice sounded like iron dragging over gravel when he read from the German Bible. People respected him. When the church elders gathered on our porch, they listened to him because his boots were always clean and his home was always orderly. My mother moved through the kitchen like smoke, silent, necessary, leaving the scent of cinnamon and lye soap behind her. She never looked my father in the eye when he spoke about rules. But her hands would tighten around the handle of her wooden spoon until her knuckles went white. It is an unsettling thing to realize that the people who gave you your name might have been keeping you from it. Have you ever sat in a room full of your own blood relatives and felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, as if everyone else was reading from a script you'd never been given? If you have ever felt that quiet, creeping isolation, or if you want to find out how the walls we build to protect ourselves can become our own prisons, take a second to subscribe. Let's stay here for a moment in the quiet and uncover what happens when the silence finally breaks. Growing up, I thought the fear in our house was just the fear of God. That is what my father called it. He told us that strictness was a hedge against the world, a wall to keep the wildness of the English life from seeping into our souls. He regulated everything: the exact width of the hems on my dresses, the volume of our laughter in the yard, the way the lantern light had to be extinguished the moment the clock struck 9. But children have a way of looking at the seams of things. We notice where the fabric is strained. For me, the strain was at the bottom of the cellar stairs. In our community, doors didn't have locks. There was no need for them. A padlock on a barn meant you didn't trust your brother, and that was a sin. But behind the rows of green mason jars filled with preserved beans and pickled beets, there was a narrow door made of rough sawn pine, and on that door hung a black iron lock, heavy and dull. I asked my mother about it once, when the air downstairs smelled of cold dirt and winter potatoes. She didn't look up from her crate. "Storage, Esther," she whispered, her voice dropping into that flat, rhythmic tone she used when she wanted the conversation to die. "Just old things your father keeps." But my father didn't keep old things. He burned what wasn't useful. Yet, if any of us so much as lingered near that door, his shadow would appear at the top of the stairs, blocking the light from the kitchen. One December afternoon, the sky the color of dirty slush, my brother Samuel bounced a small rubber ball in the kitchen. It escaped him, rolling down the cellar steps with a hollow thump, 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 before striking the locked pine door. The sound wasn't loud, but the silence that followed it was instantaneous. My father didn't walk down the steps. He descended them like a stone falling. When he reached the bottom, his face wasn't red with anger. It was gray. A terrible hollow look that I had never seen on a deacon's face before. He grabbed Samuel's arm so hard the boy's breath caught. He didn't yell. He whispered, his breath smelling of the Shekeri coffee he drank to stay awake during the long winter meetings. "You do not play here. You do not look here." Never again. We didn't. But the mind doesn't stop walking down those stairs just because your feet do. By the time I turned 14, the silence had settled into my bones like a damp draft. I learned to keep my eyes on the floorboards, to sew my stitches straight, to be the quiet, submissive daughter the church praised. But inside, the questions were turning over like dry leaves in autumn. Especially when I looked at Rebecca. Rebecca was my oldest sister, 11 years ahead of me, and she was the only thing in that farmhouse that didn't obey the gravity of my father's rules. Rebecca didn't smell like the rest of us. We smelled of wood smoke, heavy wool, and the damp earth we hoed from sunrise to dusk. But Rebecca always carried the scent of crushed peppermint leaves she kept in her apron pocket, or the sharp, clean smell of summer rain. She was beautiful in a way that made the church elders uncomfortable. When she sang during the Sunday service, her voice climbed just a fraction higher than the other women's, a clear, ringing note that seemed to bounce off the bare pine rafters, instead of dying quietly in the rows. My father would tighten his jaw, his thumb pressing so hard into the leather cover of his hymn book that the binding creaked. He didn't hate her. I know that now. He looked at her with a desperate, heavy sorrow, the way a man looks at a crop he knows the frost is going to take. He wanted to break her spirit because he believed a broken spirit was the only thing God would accept. Outwardly, I was the perfect shadow. I kept my apron pinned straight, tucked my hair completely beneath my white cap, and nodded whenever my father spoke about the dangers of the worldly mind. I held the horses' bridles without complaining when the cold bit into my palms, and I never asked why we couldn't have curtains on the windows like some of the more progressive districts down the road. But inside, I was hoarding every scrap of Rebecca's rebellion like hidden gold. I watched the way she held her chin up when my father scolded her for a crooked hem. I memorized the sound of her bare feet dancing on the rough planks of the barn loft while the thunder rolled across the fields. By the time she turned 21, the air in our kitchen had grown thick, like the moments right before a summer storm when the birds stop singing and the leaves turn upside down. The arguments always started after the lanterns were put out. My bedroom was directly above the kitchen, and I would press my ear against the cold floorboards, the splinters catching in my cheek, listening to the vibration of their voices. I couldn't hear the words, just the low, heavy rumble of my father's anger and the sharp, breathy, desperate sound of Rebecca fighting back. My mother never spoke during those nights. I could only hear the rhythmic, agonizing creak of her rocking chair moving back and forth, a metronome for our family's unraveling. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. A freezing rain was pelting the window panes, turning the dirt road outside into a river of gray mud. The house was ice cold because the wood stove had died down to embers. A sudden, violent crash from the kitchen woke me from a thin sleep, the unmistakable sound of a heavy stoneware pitcher shattering against the floor. I didn't think. I crept out of my blankets, my bare feet numb against the stairs, and stopped 3 steps from the bottom. The kitchen was illuminated only by the faint orange glow of a single oil lamp on the counter. The air smelled of spilled milk and wet wool. Rebecca was backed against the kitchen door, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her chest heaving. Her face was slick with tears and sweat. My father stood over her, his shadow stretching all the way across the ceiling, making him look twice his size. His fists were clenched at his sides. "You will destroy this family," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a terrifying, jagged edge to it, like a saw cutting through green wood. "You will drag us into the mud for your vanity." Rebecca looked up at him, and for the first time in my life I saw pure, unadulterated hatred in a person's eyes. She didn't flinch. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. "You aren't worried about my soul, Dat," she whispered, her voice cutting through the quiet house like a small, sharp knife. "You are afraid they will discover the truth." The silence that followed those words was heavier than any sermon my father had ever preached. His face went entirely blank, the rage draining out of him. replaced by that same gray, hollow terror I had seen when the ball struck the locked cellar door years before. Then, without a word, his hand flashed out. The sound of his palm hitting her cheek echoed off the bare walls like a pistol shot. Rebecca's head snapped back against the wood of the door. My mother, sitting in the dark corner by the stove, let out a small, strangled whimper, her apron pulled over her face. Then my father turned, his eyes sweeping the room until they locked onto me standing on the stairs. I couldn't breathe. The air felt like water in my lungs. He looked at me not as his daughter, but as a witness to something that could end his world. "Go upstairs, Esther," Rebecca whispered from the floor, her hand pressing against her swelling jaw. Her voice was steady, even then. "Go back to sleep." I ran. I pulled the quilts over my head and pressed my hands against my ears, shaking so violently the old rope bed creaked under me. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the fields covered in a thin, glittering crust of ice. When I came down to breakfast, Rebecca's place at the table was empty. Her blue plate sat in the center of the oilcloth, dry and clean. My mother was stirring a pot of cornmeal mush, her back to us, her shoulders hunched forward as if she were carrying a sack of grain. My father sat at the head of the table. He precisely sliced a piece of salt pork, his hands steady, his beard combed. He didn't look up when he spoke. "Your sister has chosen the outside world," he said coldly, chewing his food. "She has turned her back on the church and the covenant. We do not speak her name in this house again. In our district, when someone leaves, they are erased. It is a slow, quiet funeral that lasts for the rest of your life." Neighbors stop by, they talk about the weather, the horse auctions, the price of clover seed, and they look right past the empty chair. Within a month, it was as if Rebecca had never drawn breath under our roof. But every time I walked past the cellar stairs, I could still hear the echo of her voice in the dark, telling my father the one thing he couldn't bear to hear: the truth. The 40 years that followed Rebecca's disappearance were not loud. They were stitched together by the quiet, heavy rhythms of our fields. The spring plowing, the canning of summer peaches, the long blue shadows of winter. I grew up. I took the baptismal vows, kneeling on the hard floorboards before the new bishop, promising to uphold the order of the church until death. I married a man named Levi. He was a good man, steady and soft-spoken, whose hands always smelled of cedar shavings and horse liniment. We built a home, raised children, and watched the hair at each other's temples turn the color of frost. But a house built over a hollow space never feels entirely solid. On windy nights, when the timber creaked, I would lie beside Levi and feel the weight of what we didn't say. I remember a day when our oldest daughter was 5. Her laughter ringing out across the yard as she chased a yellow butterfly through the high clover. I froze, my hand stopping mid-air as I hung a wet sheet on the line. For a terrible, beautiful second, that laugh belonged to Rebecca. Levi must have seen the light go out of my face. He walked over from the buggy shed, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, and took the wooden clothespin from my fingers. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He already knew the phantom that lived in our kitchen. He looked out over the cornfields, his eyes squinting against the afternoon glare, and said, "A secret is like an iron nail driven deep into a young oak, Esther. The bark will grow over it until the tree looks smooth to the world, but the wood inside stays black and rotten around the iron." Standing in my parents' silent cellar at 58, holding my father's black ledger in one hand and Miriam's yellowed letters in the other, I finally felt that hidden iron tearing through my own skin. The internal conflict wasn't a sudden, sharp anger. It was a suffocating grief for the price I had paid to be considered a good daughter. For nearly 6 decades, I had bartered my own curiosity, my own voice, and my loyalty to my sister for the comfort of belonging. Every time I sat at a church singing and stayed quiet when someone dropped a whispered hint about the rebellious girls who leave the path, I had been helping my father drive that nail a little deeper. I had let them rewrite Rebecca into a cautionary tale, a wicked child who chose the glitter of the English world over the holiness of the soil, when the truth was that she had been hunted out of her own home by the very men who claimed to speak for God. Yet, as I turned the fragile pages of the ledger, looking at the messy, frantic script of my father's final years. The simplistic anger I wanted to feel refused to come. That was the tragic friction of it. My father wasn't a monster from a storybook. He was a man utterly paralyzed by the machine he had helped build. In his entries, I saw his terror, not just of the community's judgment, but of the weight of his own sin. He had truly believed that by hiding Rebecca's birth, by forcing Miriam into the dark, and by allowing the church to swallow the scandal, he was preserving the holy order of our people. He had loved Rebecca with a twisted, obsessive desperation that could only express itself in secret underground rooms and stolen photographs. He had spent his life maintaining the white fences of his reputation while the cellar of his soul rotted away. The people who kept this lie. My mother with her silent, weeping compliance. Bishop Yoder with his sharp warnings about the peace of the community. They hadn't done it out of pure malice. They did it because they feared the truth more than they loved the individual. And the cost of that holy peace was my sister's life, my mother's joy, and my own 58 years of blindness. 12 years have bled away since the night Sarah brought the snow into my kitchen and left me with my sister's words. I am 70 now. My hands are spotted like dry autumn leaves, and my joints ache when the damp air moves in across the valley. I no longer live in my father's farmhouse. We sold it years ago to a young family whose children's laughter now fills the garden, washing out the old arguments that used to linger in the corners like cobwebs. I kept only a few things from that locked cellar. Miriam's letters and the small photograph of Rebecca and Sarah smiling in the sun. They don't live in the dark anymore. They sit in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed, sweet-smelling and open to the light. Sarah still writes to me. Her letters arrive in crisp white envelopes with stamps from the outside world, and my own children, both the ones who left the community and the ones who stayed, sit at my kitchen table and listen to me read them aloud. The silence that took 58 years to build was heavy, but it took only a few years of honesty to dismantle it completely. I look at my family now, and I don't see the rigid, fragile perfection my father prayed for. I see something much better. I see people who are allowed to be fragile and allowed to be true. Africans lose their strength the moment they are given names. That is the truth it took me a lifetime to inherit. We are taught that traditions keep us safe, that walls protect us from the wilderness. But sometimes the heaviest walls are the ones we build inside our own hallways to keep from looking at our own history. I was raised to believe that obedience was the highest form of holiness. But now I know that truth is the only soil where a family can actually grow without rotting at the root. It came from finally opening the locked door nobody wanted touched. I look out the window now at the empty road, and I wonder about the other houses sitting quietly in the twilight, both inside the Amish world and far beyond it. Every family has a cellar. Every family has a narrow door they have locked and promised never to speak of, pretending the floorboards don't vibrate with the weight of it. What is the secret your own family is still carrying in the dark? What is the quiet lie you were told to protect someone else's peace, and what did it cost your soul to keep it? Pour your heart out in the comments below. Let's leave the silence behind together. And if you want to find a space where these deep, hidden human journeys are brought into the light, please subscribe to join us for weekly stories. Let's keep opening the doors we were told to fear.